Leah, thanks for taking some time for us. Let's start with the developments today, though, and the removal of the blockade at the Brady landfill. Just your thoughts on that coming down less than 2 weeks after it went up.
Well, I think the bigger point here is the fact that, families are having to plead with all levels of government to seek justice for their loved ones is unfortunate. Certainly the protests so far have been peaceful, and I know that there's plans to move to the Human Rights Museum with support from folks at the Human Rights Museum, and I continue to support the need to search the landfills.
Now, you've recently written the United Nations to call for action. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I actually wrote a submission to the Special Rapporteur back in February about the failure of all levels of government responding to the crisis of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. This is a follow-up to the submission I made in February to the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples to review the need for a study for international oversight of the search of the landfills because of examples of ongoing systemic violence. Certainly the women that were victims that we're currently searching for, Mercedes Myron, Morgan Harris, and Buffalo Woman, were all victims of failures of systemic racism. Now this is another example, and I think it requires international oversight to make sure families and certainly the Indigenous communities are protected from this ongoing systemic racism that persists in Canada.
Now, you mentioned it, there has been this jurisdictional fight over who said do what and pay for what when it comes to the landfill search. Indigenous Services Minister Mark Miller again today taking some shots at the Manitoba Premier. How do we move past that?
Well, I think the bigger picture here is the government passed Bill C-15 to fully adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Winnipeg has signed up as a human rights city, and that means that they need to uphold the basic human rights that are articulated in articles in UNDRIP. That includes Article 7, Articles 21 and 22 that certainly apply in this case, and I would argue as well Article 12. The feds have judiciary obligations here, but also the city and province have obligations here. I do agree, and I'm hoping that the Premier will reconsider her position, but I call on all levels of government to stop pointing fingers, to stop with the jurisdictional games and do the right thing and search the landfills and provide the families whatever they should need for justice, and that could include anything from that to providing actual compensation for the families. Let's not forget the province continued to use that landfill after the police came out and said that they suspected that certainly Morgan Harris and Mercedes Myron were in the landfill. That was under their jurisdiction and certainly an act of contaminating an active crime scene. So I think we need to stop pointing fingers, and everybody needs to do what they need to do to uphold human rights that are articulated in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Families deserve justice. Our communities deserve justice.
Just quickly and lastly here, Leah, where do you think things go next with the possibility of a land search? Do you think we'll see a search happen before the snow flies?
Well, that's certainly not up to me, but I can tell you I'm going to continue supporting families, supporting our community. Let's not forget the federal government to date has only responded to 2 calls to justice of the 231 calls for justice in the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. This has become a normalized genocide in this country. This has become normalized violence, and I'm going to continue to speak up against it.
Leah, we'll have to leave it there. Appreciate you taking the time for us here today.
Thank you so much for having me.